spiritual enlightenment, simply stated, is energy becomes what it thinks about. If we can stay focused on the idea that reality is composed of energy, thought, and form, of spirit, mind, and body, of infinite being, infinite intelligence, and infinite manifestation, if we can stay focused on that fundamental truth, then it's very difficult to get confused. So all there is in life is energy, thought, and form. And we've all heard the idea that thought is creative and that we become what we think about. As a result of the affirmations that we just worked with, you could also express it by saying we are our vocabulary. And the quality of our vocabulary determines the quality of our consciousness and the quality of our life. So it's a little more radical when you put it that way. And so at the level of the mind, there is nothing but words. Our mind is controlled by our vocabulary. And so the more we concentrate on high-quality words, the more fun life becomes. Because we raise the quality of our energy and we begin to consciously express the qualities of our divine nature, which are expressed in high-quality words. So, spiritual enlightenment should become universal, and we're probably making more progress in this century than any century in the last several thousand years. And so adult education is the name of the game. And most people are concerned about the economy. The greatest industry in our economy should be adult education. Because traditionally, education has said, well, adults are hopeless, let's concentrate on the kids. But unfortunately, the adults ruin the kids. And so it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. And so the adult education industry is a dynamic aspect of our economy. And anybody, I have inspired thousands, tens of thousands of people to enter the adult education industry because if you have enough self-esteem and you have anything of value to share with other people, you can make a living in the adult education industry. And some of the top earning people in our economy are in the self-improvement industry, the adult education industry. Tony Robbins, Wayne Dyer, Deepak Chopra, myself, there's tens of thousands of people who are earning good living in adult education. And so it's a field that is open to anybody. You just have to have self-esteem and a big mouth. Or, in my case, a quiet mouth. You could even make a living with a quiet mouth. We'll leave the spiritual dimension and go to the physical dimension. The most valuable idea in the physical dimension is the idea of physical immortality, including the physical body into the conscious life of the eternal spirit is a fantastic definition of physical immortality. And so most people are dedicated to trashing the body. All religions, all Orthodox religions are based upon the idea of trashing the body. And God never had that idea. God says that the human body is the most beautiful thing in the universe. It is the most highly evolved, fantastic thing in the universe, the human body. And so psychologists say we have 50,000 thoughts per day. Biologists say the body has millions of thoughts every second, which means that the body is over 1,000 times smarter than the mind. Think about that. So we don't have in our society a community of people that is dedicated to the mind learning from the body. We're still into trashing the body. And the body is 1,000 times smarter than the mind. So I became fascinated by this idea. I won't go into it in depth, but in 1977, I realized that I didn't have the answers and that my body was doing things without my permission. And so I wanted to meet actual immortals who had maintained their body for at least 300 years and find out what their secrets were. And so I went to India looking for people that were over 300 years old. On my first trip to India, I didn't find any. On my second trip to India, I did. And since then, I met over 8 individuals who are over 300 years old, some of them 2,000, and some of them even older than 2,000. So most people like the idea of physical immortality until they figure out what it means. It means living with yourself forever. And most people, they want to escape. They want to escape. And so they leave the body, but the value of death is highly overrated. If death and reincarnation was the solution, we wouldn't be as stupid as we are. It didn't work. Going to heaven didn't really work. And so we have to take a look at our willingness to live with ourselves forever. And that involves healing the emotional mind. Healing the emotional mind. Making the subconscious conscious and healing all of our negativity and bringing our mind into harmony with our divine nature. It's a fantastic concept. It's a revolutionary, radical concept. The idea of actually healing ourselves is a totally radical concept. The traditional path is to go to school for at least 16 years. When we get out of school, we get a job. When we get a job, our parents tell us, now it's time to get married. And after we get married for a couple of years, our parents say, now it's time to have kids. And then we have kids, we raise them through college, and then it's time to die. So that's the value system. And even if you achieve the American dream, which is to have a beautiful house in suburbia, and 1 or 2 or a half a dozen cars, it doesn't work. It doesn't work unless we take responsibility for the mind, the quality of the content of the mind. So taking responsibility for the quality of the content of the human mind is still a radical, unpopular idea. The idea of healing ourselves totally is still a radical idea. And so when you meet a person who's over 300 years old, they have to enjoy living with themselves.
Do they? Do they?
Yeah.
They do.
And they have to enjoy living with the body. And after meeting 8 of these immortals, I noticed that none of them gave a lecture on how to live forever, how to master the body. They didn't give a lecture. And so I noticed that there was a tremendous difference between a guy who is 300 years old, who referred to himself as a child yogi, who is just learning, and Bartraji, who I included a chapter on in my book, Breaking the Death Habit, who was 2,000 years old. And Bartraji meditated for 700 years before he became a master of the physical universe. Maybe some of you have heard the name Swami Ramalinga. Any of you heard the name Swami Ramalinga? Well, Swami Ramalinga lived in the 1800s, and when he was 55 years old in 1864, he dematerialized his body. He taught deathless consciousness, and he embodied it so greatly. He wrote a beautiful book, and his body became such an embodiment of light that he had no shadow. Think about that. And when he walked by dead people, they automatically raised from the dead. He didn't even have to work at it. Just his presence caused dead people to come back from the dead. And so he believed that if he dematerialized his body, that his deathless consciousness would be spread over the earth and everybody would become deathless. Did it work? So Christianity has believed for 2,000 years that the death of Jesus saved the world, right? Did it work? When Kabir was dedicated, he was actually a Muslim, but he was dedicated to creating peace among the Muslims and the Christians and the Hindus in India. And when he decided to leave his body, and they were having a funeral, and his body was laying in a casket at the meeting. And so he had thousands of followers among Christians and among Muslims and among Hindus. And so his followers were arguing about what to do with the body. The Christians and the Muslims wanted to bury it, and the Hindus wanted to burn it. So in the middle of his funeral, he sat up in his casket and he said, "My children, why are you always fighting?" And then he took the shroud, put it over his head, laid back down in the casket. And so they continued fighting about what they were going to do with the body. And they decided to cut his body in half. And the Christians and the Muslims would bury their half, and the Hindus would burn their half. Well, when they lifted the shroud, there was just a pile of roses. And so the Muslims and the Christians took half the roses, buried them there. And the Hindus burned their half. Think about that. Well, is resurrecting your body like Jesus did a greater miracle than turning your body into roses? So when we actually examine history and the saints of history who have achieved high levels of mastery, it boggles our mind, totally boggles our mind, which of course it's intended to do, and hopefully to boggle it enough that we can contact enough of our natural divinity to be inspired to heal ourselves and to realize the divine given potential that God has given us to become masters. to become masters of our own mind, our own body, and to realize our potential as beautiful human beings. Is there anything wrong with becoming a beautiful, immortal human being? Well, Swami Ramalinga, it's interesting because if you study Mary Baker Eddy, who taught the difference between mortal consciousness and immortal consciousness, her spiritual inspiration and ministry and her book, Science and Health, the Key to the Scriptures, which is one of the greatest books that America has produced, started about the same time that Swami Ramalinga dematerialized. It's very interesting to wonder if there is a relationship between Swami Rama's intention and Mary Baker Eddy's ministry. The Christian Science Church, which she established, has healed millions of people of everything known to man. Every physical faculty. When she was still alive, they brought her a guy that was run over by a truck. His body was totally mangled. And in an hour, she made it perfect. Just by spiritual healing. And Christian Science practitioners are still healing millions of people all over the world. Swami Ramalinga actually reincarnated. He reincarnated about 30 or 40 years ago, and he remembers exactly what happened when he dematerialized his body. And it wasn't the ideal dematerialization. He spent several days getting his whole body to dematerialize. And it was a struggle. And so his current name is Dr. Pillai. You can Google Dr. Pillai. And he is still teaching people how to build a light body. He does, I think, probably at least a weekly class on the internet, and people all over the world can learn how to turn their physical body into a light body. So we are making progress. The 21st century may turn out to be better than we expect, in spite of ourselves. And we just have to keep tuning in to the best information. I like to read at least 2 books a week and 5 or 10 magazines. I just constantly, and I work with mantras and I work with affirmations, and I am constantly working on improving the quality of my own mind and feelings and emotions. And so I've gotten to the place where my mind and body goes through changes almost every day. Every day is like a psychedelic experience for me. I never know what to expect. And my biggest problem is to decide whether or not to participate in this change and to direct this change, or to just go along for the ride. And we have to learn how to just go along for the ride. That's totally amazing. I spoke at Fairfield, Iowa, the Maharishi University a few times. And the last time, well, in Fairfield, Iowa is a fantastic place because the population of the whole town is about 9,000 people. And they have 2 huge geodesic domes, and 1,000 women meditate for 90 minutes twice a day, and 1,000 women meditate for 1,000 men meditate for 90 minutes twice a day in the men's dome. So you have 2,000 people meditating for 3 hours a day. And Imagine the impact that has on the community of 9,000 people. And of course, a lot of them have day jobs. And so, I mean, some of them are financially independent, but some of them have day jobs and they work in the community and they own businesses in the community. And imagine a community of 9,000 people that is being influenced by 2,000 people spending 3 hours in transcendental meditation every day. A multimillionaire donated enough money so that anybody who wants to can go to Fairfield, Iowa, and apply for the job of becoming a full-time meditator. And you will receive a salary that's enough to pay for your food and rent. And you can be a full-time meditator. So I love going to that community and giving lectures because the energy is really high. You can feel it when you walk on the town square. It's a very interesting place. So during my last lecture there, I said, I don't know if the Maharishi has enlightened more people than Henry Ford. Think about it. If you have a half-hour commute from home to work, it's almost impossible to spend 30 minutes in your car without going into the transcendental state involuntarily, at least for a few seconds or a few minutes. In spite of the fact that you're concentrating on driving, you're concentrating on your day, your mind has a tendency to stop for a few seconds or a few minutes. And so the automobile is the most successful teacher of meditation that God has ever invented. And the next time you take a long drive in your car, think about it. Did God invent the automobile? The automobile in most of our mind is the antithesis to God, right? It's the total antithesis to spirit. But the physical universe is 100% spirit. I mean, the Bible says that the last enemy is death. And the reason that the last enemy is death is because it's the only enemy. If we conquer death, we don't have any more enemies. An economist told me that the average life of a Fortune 500 company is 40 years. So how does a company of thousands of people with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of income every year self-destruct? It self-destructs because of the death urge, the unconscious death urge. And the founder of the company, the management of the company, the employees of the company, and even the stockholders of the company. Our entire economy is based upon the idea that death is inevitable and beyond our control. And businesses destroy themselves when the unconscious death urge starts to take over the minds of the owners and the management and the employees of a company. And so healing the death urge, I'm getting into the third category, which is healing the emotional mind. And the basic idea, the greatest idea in the 21st century to heal the mind is an idea which I call personal law. A personal law is a thought that controls your life. And so everybody has a personal law, one thought that controls their life more than any other thought. And so to understand, to look for and understand that thought is the most valuable knowledge we can have about ourselves in the mental category. And so when I discovered this concept, I became a business consultant, and every client that I had who had the mathematical opportunity to double their income, doubled their income as a result of working with the idea of personal law. When I used my intuitive skill to verbalize their personal law, gave them affirmation to change it, they doubled their income automatically. And so when I started giving a lecture about personal law, I couldn't read everybody's mind in a large group of people, and so I decided to look for the common denominators of the personal laws of all the hundreds of clients that I had, and I came up with 5. First one was birth trauma. Second one was the parental disapproval syndrome. The third one I called specific negatives, which means the misuse of the human mind. If we didn't receive enough damage from our birth trauma and our parents, we create damage to ourselves, all by ourselves. Then there's the unconscious death urge and karma from previous lifetimes. And so in the Rebirthers Manual book, my co-author added, well, since the, I called them the 5 biggies originally, but I added 3 more, which were school trauma, religion trauma, and senility.
Senility.
Senility, yeah. And then Fanny added the denial of the feminine principle. And since she added the denial of the feminine principle, I had to add the denial of the masculine principle. And so then it kept building to 15 biggies. Other ones are sexual abuse, food abuse, political apathy, and the biggest, which is I call emotional energy pollution. And I have a handout on that, but I want to say something about birth trauma and the death urge before we go on. I gave a lecture in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and a very handsome young obstetrician came to my lecture. And he said, I've heard about rebirthing, and since I've been out of medical school, I have adopted the Le Boyer method of giving birth. How many of you know the Le Boyer method? Okay, so the Le Boyer method is the idea of designing the birth environment for the benefit of the mother and the baby instead of the medical profession. And so in the Le Boyer method, the lights are low, there's no sound, and when the baby comes out of the womb, the baby is taken gently, placed in a tub of hot water with about womb temperature, and with the umbilical cord still attached. And the tub of hot water is, of course, by the mother. The umbilical cord is still attached. And so the mother is still with the baby, can look at the baby, can touch the baby is in warm water. And so the obstetrician observes the baby in silence until the baby opens. And the memory of the birth trauma is erased. And the baby blisses out. I mean, it's totally logical and natural, right? But it's totally revolutionary. Still, in most hospitals in the world, they attack the umbilical cord within 10 minutes after birth. And the rebirthing movement has healed thousands of people of migraine headaches. And the healing usually takes place when a person is regressed into the memory of the cutting of the umbilical cord, and they remember experiencing deprivation of oxygen to the brain. And when they relive that memory, migraine headaches disappear. So this obstetrician said, I heard about rebirthing, and I'm glad to hear your lecture. It was very interesting, and I wanted to thank you very much. I had such good parents, and I don't know much about my birth, but I probably won't do rebirthing. But I wanted to let you know that I'm doing the Leboyer method and that I'm helping you solve the problem at the source of the problem. And so a year later, I was lecturing again at Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the same obstetrician came to my lecture, and he listened to the lecture with interest. And at the end of the lecture, he said, I came back because I wanted to tell you something. He said, I gave all my patients the best birth that I could possibly give them, and they went home. The babies went home blissed out. But what I noticed is that the infants learned the birth trauma as a result of living with their parents. Think about that. So he said the value of my work was being destroyed by the parents. And so he said, I realized, partially as a result of your lecture a year ago, that I had to take the parents through 10 sessions during the pregnancy.
Educate them.
Yeah. And so then I realized I had to go through 10 sessions to become a rebirther. So he said, I came back to let you know that I did 10 sessions. I'm rebirthing the parents of the kids that I'm delivering in an enlightened way. And now when they go home, they don't relearn the birth trauma from their parents. Totally mind-blowing. That babies, after they have been given a perfect birth, learn birth trauma as a result of living their parents. That's completely mind-blowing information.
But it makes sense.
So there was a rebirther who worked as an obstetrics nurse in a home for unwed mothers. And in some cases, she could give the girls sessions before the delivery. But whenever that wasn't possible, the obstetrician, who never did rebirthing and didn't believe in rebirthing, would love it when his nurse would rebirth the girls in the middle of the delivery process. Think about that one. Because they didn't scream as much. So his life was made more pleasant if his nurse rebirthed the girls in the middle of the birthing process. Totally amazing. Totally amazing. So, healing birth trauma in our society is totally amazing. And one of my good friends is a guy named Igor Tchaikovsky, who is a Russian, who popularized giving birth underwater. And so in that method, the mother is immersed in water, the baby comes out underwater, which of course is an idea that totally blew the minds of American medical minds. Because they don't even have the concept that the baby can come from water into water without drowning. It's a revolutionary concept. Well, as a result of my relationship to him, and I gave my first child the perfect underwater birth. And she's been a genius ever since. She could master any musical instrument in a month when she was in high school. She was straight A all the way through university. And she's now married, has a son of her own. And the bonding process between my daughter and her son, it was the most beautiful thing I ever saw. And so my son was born 9 years later, but my wife unconsciously set up the situation to relive her own birth trauma. She was in an incubator for several days after her birth. And so I had a relationship with, well, actually, she had it all set up to do an underwater birth, like our daughter, but unconsciously, she created the birth happening in a hospital. The doctor actually allowed me to catch my son, and then they cut the umbilical cord. There wasn't any way I could change the hospital policy. And he had a traumatic birth. My wife, they gave her permission to take him into the bathtub in the hospital. And she's Polish. She has a lot of food anxiety. And she was trying to force feed him on the breast. He choked. And just before that happened, she asked my daughter and I to go to the car and get something for her. And when we came back, my son was in the emergency ward of the hospital. And so I managed to get him out of the hospital in 24 hours because I wanted to take him home and give him, I learned how to rebirth infants in the early years of my career. And so I wanted to take him home and give him rebirthing experiences. Well, I managed to get him out of the hospital in 24 hours, which is like getting a person out of prison. And I started rebirthing him by just taking him into the water, and the warm bath has a tendency automatically to stimulate the birth memory. And infants scream. They scream, bloody murder, for a half an hour to an hour. They scream. And what's your tendency? If an infant is screaming, what you want to do, right? You want to stop the screaming, right? Well, you can't do that. You can't do that. You have to just create a supportive, safe environment for the infant to go through the memory of their birth trauma, which is physiological as well as emotional. It's terrifying to watch. It shakes you at the very ground of your being to watch a newborn baby relive their birth trauma. And so they scream until their muscles become so exhausted they can't scream. And what happens? They take a deep breath. As soon as they take a deep breath, it relaxes them back into their birth trauma and they start screaming again. So you just have to wait. You just have to wait until they get so exhausted again that they take another deep breath. Well, after that happens several times, the infinite and their personal connection to infinite intelligence, which is something that you have to respect in infants, figure out that it feels better to breathe than to scream. When that realization hits their mind, they have the most beautiful connected rebirthing breathing that you can imagine. They go into absolute bliss, which is so powerful that if there are any adults, it's contagious. You just go totally into bliss, and they just are transformed into the most angelic beings you can imagine. So now looking back on it, I made the mistake of taking a bath with him every day for 3 days. After 3 days, I realized that it wasn't a good idea, that I was just causing too much stress. And so I decided to not give him any more sessions, to let him live with the bliss that he achieved in his last session until his birth memory started coming up spontaneously. Well, it only takes 5 days or a week, and they become cranky, and they start to get irritable, and they start screaming. And so when I saw his birth memory coming to the surface, I would take him in the tub and give him another rebirthing experience. Well, his mother said, I don't want you rebirthing my son anymore. I can't stand it. You're torturing him. And I said, okay. I knew enough about women to know that women are always right and that men just have to surrender.
Are you sure about that?
And so I said, okay. And so a week or so, 10 days went by. My wife was rocking my son in the rocking chair, and guess what happened? He started screaming. And so she tried the nipple, she tried everything to get him to stop screaming, and nothing worked. And so finally she stood up, she handed him to me, and he said, here, you take him, I'm leaving the house, I can't stand it. So after that, she let me rebirth him. Well, it only took about 15 sessions to completely wipe out his birth trauma. And after that, he was a perfectly happy, energetic, totally brilliant boy for the rest of his life. And so when he was in high school, he could master any musical instrument in a week. He was playing in a symphony orchestra with adults when he was 15, and one of the other performers got sick, and the conductor needed that instrument, and he knew my son's ability. He said to my son, we only have 2 days before the concert. Can you master a new instrument and play in the concert? He mastered the new instrument in 2 days, played in the concert. When he was 17, he was selected to compose the full-length score of a movie. He composed the music for a movie, conducted the orchestra at 17, and you can watch the movie on the internet. It's called The Phantom Carriage. It's a very famous Swedish movie, silent movie. And so the background music is all important for the movie.
The screaming versus breathing experience, could that be transferable to the death process? Where screaming, it's the physical pain?
Yes. Yeah, well, there's a relation between birth and death. Yeah. And so the relationship between birth and death is built into Catholic theology, because Catholic theology says there's no perfection in this life. You have to die in order to experience perfection. And so if you look at the symbology for heaven, you're sitting there in heaven forever. You don't have anything to do. You don't have to eat. And that's a symbology for the womb. In the womb, you're floating in warm water. You're hugged 24 hours a day. You don't have to eat. You're fed through the umbilical cord. And there's nothing but bliss, except to the extent that you have to process the emotions of your mother and father, which of course is where the psychological doctrine of original sin comes from. And so the belief is that you have to die to get back into the womb. I mean, physiologically that's true, right? We have to go through death in order to get back into the womb. And that the womb is the ultimate place to be in terms of our experience. So the womb is the dominant impression on the human psyche and physiology. We're immersed in water for 9 months. And my friend Igor Tchaikovsky, he took premature babies that were destined to die, convinced the parents to stay in the bathtub 24 hours a day with the baby for 3 months, which actually completed the gestation of the child. And the children became geniuses. They became superior physiologically. They became great athletes, emotionally and intellectually and socially. Think about the social implications of being in the bathtub with one of your parents 24 hours a day for 3 months. How many people have had that experience? So I've shared that information with a lot of rebirthers all over the world, and when people who've done rebirthing had a premature birth, they would just spend more time with the baby in the bathtub. If not 24 hours, they would spend as much time as possible in the bathtub with the baby. And they became fantastic beings, little beings. And it's good for the parents, too. So he got the idea, Igor got the idea, well, if it works on this end, maybe it'll work on the other end. So he found a senior citizen who had lots of diseases. He convinced them to go into the bathtub for 3 months. All of his diseases disappeared. And he rejuvenated himself. Hydrotherapy, water is...
So you change the water every day?
I mean, we've just begun. We have just begun to understand the benefits of hydrotherapy. Yes.
Would you have data about this process that you're talking about with adopted children? Can you rebirth after the fact if you have adopted a child of 1 year old, 2 years old?
Yes, yes, it is possible.
Do you have data?
But I wouldn't attempt to do it unless the parents have been through 10 sessions. So taking the parents through 10 sessions is the first step. And then the children have a tendency to go through sessions automatically. And actually, it's interesting, and it's never been documented fully, but it should be documented to study and record the transformation of the children that happens automatically when you take the parents through 10 sessions. There's so much research that still needs to be done. We have seen a few cases of autism completely disappear when the parents go through 10 sessions. And in one case, a woman in New Zealand went through 9 sessions. She said, I wonder if this would work with my daughter, who was 9 years old, but she was autistic. And I said, yeah, go for it. Her autism disappeared in only 1 session. Other cases that I've worked on that take a lot more than 1 session, but it's
Thank you.
it definitely produces all kinds of changes. Who owns the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States? Who owns the National Bank of Canada? Who owns the Federal Reserve Bank of India? Who owns the National Bank of Spain? Anybody know? You can read about them on the internet. It's called the city. The city is 1 mile square piece of real estate in central London, which is a separate country. It is a separate country that is over 1,000 years old, At one point, there was war between the country of England and the city negotiated a truce, and then they proceeded to take over the government of England. And today, nothing can be even discussed on the floor of Parliament in England without approval from a committee in the city. The city totally owns and operates the country of England, Canada, every other country in the world which has a national bank are owned and operated by agents that are trained in the city. In the Senate, in the United States Senate, you cannot discuss anything on the floor of the Senate unless it is approved by a committee, unless it comes out of a committee. Actually, Rand Paul discovered rules that enabled him to get onto the floor of the Senate the bill to audit the Federal Reserve Bank. He manipulated that action in spite of the control of the city, and it's still being discussed in the Senate. The United States House of Representatives passed legislation to eliminate the IRS totally several times, but it never even got onto the floor of the Senate. So the city totally owns and controls the United States government through the United States Senate. And I won't go into all the particulars of that, but the city has been training their agents for 1,000 years in order to create and maintain the money system of any country that they could conquer. And there's only two countries. Well, there's actually Muslim countries. The Quran forbids the charging of interest, and so the banks in Muslim countries do not charge interest. We in the free world, we don't even realize that. Notice, you see, the bankers keep telling us that we live in the free world, right? Yeah. So as long as we believe that we live in the free world, we won't question the system.
So you stop believing it.
But how many of you noticed that the rebels of Libya had a national bank and were printing national banknotes to be the new money system in Libya before Gaddafi was even killed? Anybody notice that? No. How many of you noticed that when the euro was established in Europe, that the beginning interest was 3%? I couldn't find anybody in France and any other country that knew that the bankers charged 3% interest on all of the euros in circulation. That subsequently amounted to so much money that they couldn't spend it all, and they voluntarily reduced the interest to 2%. Think about that. Think about that. And so they have so much money that they created social welfare projects. Like when I was working in Tenerife, I discovered that all the roads on the island were built by the European Union as a gift to the people of Tenerife. And but the bankers own the banking system of Tenerife, and they own the governments of Tenerife. And their goal in every case is to get the national debt so large that the entire budget from all tax income doesn't even pay the interest. And so you read about it in the news every year, right? In the United States, there's a debate about raising the debt limit. None of the tax income goes to pay government expenses, but the media system, owned and operated by the bankers, keeps trying to convince people that they have to support the government by paying taxes voluntarily in order to pay government expenses. But none of the tax income goes to pay government expenses. It goes only towards the interest of the national debt. And so the government has to borrow the entire budget every year, and it gets added to the national debt. That's the game that we're living in. And which one of you is going to change it in Canada?
What's the first step?
Well, you better enter the adult education business if you're going to do anything about the system. And so they own every country that has a national bank. And they're in the process of taking over Muslim countries. Iraq now has a national bank. Libya has a national bank. And so the game goes. They're trying to take over Saudi Arabia peacefully. And I just had a trainee at my training center from Saudi Arabia. We had a discussion about that. It's very interesting. Because he said that people understand enough so that in Saudi Arabia that national banks are not going to take over the country in the immediate future. It's a very interesting game. And of course, Red China, the government owns all the banks. And so the government prints all the money. And it's funny to watch the most intelligent people in the media, including people who should know better, talk about China. They talk about China's debt China, as if it was real. It's not real. I mean, the government can print the money instantly to pay all the debts of the banks if they want to do that. The government knows that the banking system is just a game. And so they are the richest country in the world, and there's no way that the bankers are going to take over Red China. And the bankers drove all the manufacturing industries out of the United States and Canada to China. Good. So understanding that we have the right, the natural, divine, political, legal, and economic right to print money is the most valuable idea of the 21st century in the economic category. So in the political social sphere, the basic idea is spiritual community. Having a weekly support group. And so we all need a support group for our spiritual health, our physical health, our mental health, our economic health, and our social health. We all require support and encouragement and discipline that a group can supply by continually reminding us of the adult information that really works and brings about a transformation of our mind and body as well as our community. So the idea of having a weekly support group is a fantastically valuable idea. It's an alternative family. It gives us an opportunity to have a spiritual family that theoretically will enable us to correct all the damage that was done by our blood family. And so politically, the way that would work is that we would have an elected representative for every 1,000 people. If we have an elected representative for every 1,000 people, it would only take $10 a month, which would supply a budget of $10,000 a month to support our elected representative as a full-time grassroots community representative. And it would be the job of these representatives to watch government, to protect us from government, which is the ideal of democracy, right? I mean, we were all schooled in this idea, but it's been lost. And so we have, the ratio of representation is the secret to the structural reform of Republican democracy so that it actually represents the people instead of abuses the people, which is the situation that we are in now. In 1955, I became a Christian. I was 17, and I had a mountaintop spiritual experience. And I was told that when I became a Christian, God the Father and Jesus Christ would come and live with me in my mind, and that I would have eternal life. So that sounded good to me as a teenager. And so afterwards, I was invited to go to a church camp and study the Bible, and I fell in love with the Bible. And I spent a year between high school and college, most of the time studying the Bible. When I actually went to college, I could read King James English better than 20th century English. I was a failure of American educational system, and I never read a book all the way through before I graduated from high school, including Peter Rabbit. So after being in college for a couple of years, my friends told me that they were having a funeral for a member of the church. And I said, well, it must be the church member wasn't a Christian, because Christians don't die. They have eternal life. And so my friends said, well, Christians do die. That was a totally revolutionary concept. I never thought about it before. I was still in my teens. And so the idea that Christians could die in spite of the fact of what the Bible promised was a revolutionary concept. So I asked all my college professors and my local ministers, why do Christians die? And I never got a satisfactory answer. I didn't stop asking the question, but I mean, I did stop asking the question, but because it was fruitless. And so then when I graduated from college, I read the autobiography of a yogi by Paramount Yogananda, and I read about immortal yogis. And so then I asked the question, how come yogis can become immortal and Christians can't? Well, I came across books about physical immortality, and I became enlightened in 1960, which is that I understood the relationship of spirit, mind, and body, and that energy becomes what it thinks about. And I started raising the quality of my thoughts and improving myself. And then from 1965 until 1967, I noticed that I was suicidal most of the time. So in the summer of 1967, I said, hey, you're spiritually enlightened. You've been improving yourself for 7 years. How come you feel like committing suicide all the time? And so I said, well, that's not supposed to, the way it's supposed to be. If you're spiritually enlightened, you're not supposed to be feeling like committing suicide all the time. So I decided to look at the situation, I realized that my mother died in 1956, my father died in 1959, and that the death urge of my family tradition was tightening its grip around my soul and was trying to kill me. So the death urge is a psychic entity composed of all of our anti-life thoughts. A psychic entity is energy and thought, energy and information. It is a sub-personality. And it's no secret that the death urge takes over people's lives, right? And so I realized that I had to heal the death urge. And so I decided to devote myself full-time to healing the death urge, which I learned from my family tradition. So I worked with affirmations. I brought up every negative thought that I could find in my consciousness about life, and my anti-life thoughts and belief systems about life and death, and transform them all into life-supporting thoughts. It was a full-time job for 6 months. And after 6 months, I woke up one morning in total bliss. I didn't feel like committing suicide anymore. And so after that, life went from being a struggle to being effortless. Because struggle comes from the death urge. It comes from our anti-life thoughts. And everything changed in my life. Life became easy, became a pleasure, yes.
Do you believe evil to be man-made then?
What's man-made?
Evil. Do you believe like evil, everything like that we consider to be evil to be something man-made? Do you believe in plurality? Duality actually? Like in the universe, you believe there's like a negative side and a positive side or something like that?
You're asking me several questions.
Well,
Slow
it's
down.
the same thing.
So, was the first question, evil is man-made?
Yeah, do you believe it to be
Yes,
man-made?
absolutely, yes. It's, it's just created by our anti-life thoughts, negation of our divine nature. And my definition of pain is that it's the effort of clinging to a negative thought. And so there are two kinds of negative thoughts. Negative thoughts about created things and negative thoughts about uncreated things. So the only uncreated thing is our divine nature. And so if you have a negative thought about your car being destroyed, it can give you pain, right? But if you have a negative thought about your divine nature, like I am stupid, I am weak, I am powerless, I am miserable, then that's a thought of a different order. And the only way that you can get rid of the pain is to change the thoughts. And so to the extent that we have negative thoughts about our divine nature, they continually cause cycles of pain and misery of all kinds. And so we have to change that. So I reread all of the books that I had read about physical immortality, and I realized after I healed my death urge that none of the authors of these books lived to be 100. And so believing in physical immortality doesn't make you immortal. And if you go back to the book of Genesis and the Bible, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the mind, and the fruit of the mind is our beliefs. And so to trust our beliefs, whether it's belief that death is inevitable and beyond our control, or the belief in physical immortality, is part of the problem. The solution is to eat the tree of life. The tree of life is the source of the mind. And if we forget that we are the source of the mind, then we become trapped in our mind and in our beliefs, ideas, feelings, and memories. And to the extent that we are trapped in our ideas, beliefs, thoughts, and memories, we become the victim of the mind. So we have to continually live in the reality beyond the mind and become the source of the mind. So I became effortlessly successful as a business and personal consultant for 7 years. And after I healed my death urge, I felt safe enough in my own mind and body to have birth memories and prenatal memories. I remembered what my mother was thinking when she found out I was in her womb. And so I was the youngest of 6 kids. My mother didn't want any more after the first 3. The first 3 were about 18 months apart. She got pregnant again with my brother. The first 3 were girls. Then she had both kinds. She didn't want any more kids. Then 4 years later, she had my sister. And then 4 years after that, she had me. Well, she didn't want kids for 12 years before I showed up. So imagine how she felt when she found out I was in there. That was the beginning of my misery in this life. And I tried to hang myself on the umbilical cord. So to commit suicide was the only way I could please my mother. Interesting problem. And whenever we discovered in the rebirthing movement that a child had the umbilical cord around the neck, it was basically because they were an unwanted child. On some level, they were not expected and were unwanted. And so I started working on myself and healing my birth trauma as well as my death urge. And so in the 70s, when I started teaching a seminar called Spiritual Psychology, I talked about some of my birth memories, and many of the people in the workshop wanted to have birth memories. They said, we want to have birth memories. How do we have birth memories? And so I suggested that they get into their bathtub and stay there until they felt like it was time to get out, and then to stay there another hour. Because I learned in my own experience that when I felt like getting out of the bath, it was an arbitrary decision based upon urgency, based upon I have to go to work and pay the rent or whatever reasons. And when I decided to ignore that urge and relax back into the tub, I would relax through the urgency barrier into a fantastic realization about myself, which would bring about tremendous elation and energy and knowledge about myself. And so these people went home and tried that, and they came back to another lecture I did a month later, and they said, we all had such powerful experiences that we wish you had been there so we could talk to you about what we were going through. And they said, we're all so weird that we can't talk to our family members about stuff like this. And so we would like the next time we take a bath for you to come and be there. That's kind of radical. And so we got the idea of a person sitting next to another person who was taking a bath so that they had somebody to talk to. And then we got the idea of using a snorkel, having a big hot tub, putting people into the water with a snorkel and nose clips with 2 people, one person to support the body so they didn't lose touch with their experience, the other person to watch the snorkel so they didn't drown. And people had such powerful experiences that they went home and told their friends that they had the most powerful experience of their entire lives. And their friends started coming over to my house. I built this hot tub in my basement, and there was a never-ending stream of people coming to my house, paying money, going into the basement, taking off their clothes with total stranger, getting into the hot tub with a snorkel, having the most powerful experience of their entire lives, going home, telling all their friends, and all their friends came. Yes?
This last sharing brings me to ask you the following question. Of the 5 key ideas of the last century, which one do you consider the most critical? To go in the tub?
Well, we have to start at the level of spiritual causation. And so spiritual enlightenment is the most important.
The first step.
And that has a natural tendency to produce an understanding of the rest. So we didn't have any idea what we were doing. We were just putting people in hot tubs with a snorkel, and it became a profitable business. And people wanted to become rebirthers and put other people in hot tubs. And it started spreading all over the world. And so I had several questions. One question is, how many rebirthing sessions do people need? And so when I thought about that, the most logical answer I came up with is that they need to have enough sessions until they can give themselves sessions, until they become spiritually self-sufficient enough and they're able to handle the sensations and the emotions sufficiently to give sessions to themselves. And so the second question came up was whether or not the water was necessary, because I'd learned that the breathing rhythm was the key to the experience. And I asked the question after a year, I wonder if it's possible to give people a rebirthing experience just by guiding the breathing rhythm into the rhythm that I saw happening spontaneously without the water. And so I experimented with that and discovered that it was not only possible, but it was more desirable.
Where I experimented rebirth, we used to have weekends of rebirth not in the water. And then after that, we had experiences in the water.
Uh-huh.
But we finished the rebirth out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
What I experiment is many rebirths out of the water, but when you're right when you say it's a very strong experience when you do it in the water.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I needed for myself that to go further in my rebirthing.
Right. Yes.
It was like I left the control.
Well, the basic rule that I established was that you should do 10 breathing sessions before water sessions. And having a rebirther is beneficial during water sessions as well as dry sessions because of the objective presence, as well as a rebirther by definition is a person theoretically who's had at least 10 sessions or 100 sessions, and they have a unique presence that facilitates the sessions of the people who are receiving sessions. But it's valuable to to do warm water sessions and cold water sessions, which are a part of the rebirthing experience. And my problem from the beginning always has been to have enough high-quality rebirthers to catch up with the demand. And so it's still my problem. And so I spend all my time training rebirthers. And so you can't force anybody to have training. It's a voluntary situation, and people just have to have the internal realization to get enough training to have enough self-esteem to offer it to others, communication skill, love, gentleness, and intuition to guide the sessions. And when people develop those qualities, they have a never-ending supply of clients. When I was in India last year, a rebirther, a beautiful young lady who was a rebirther, took me to Starbucks for coffee. And she said, it's true. When I'm tuned in to Source, I have more clients than I can handle. When I lose it, my clients call up and cancel their appointments. And so this is the only profession that I know that is based upon the divine presence of the facilitator. So being a professional is a totally separate mentality than living in the essence of spiritual energy. And when you're in that essence, you can never keep up with the demand. I'm in constant demand in over 30 countries, and I have to say no all the time.
I have a question about consciousness. I have a question about consciousness.
Yeah.
We've been talking about consciousness, and I'm always like, the more older I get, the more questions I have.
You don't have to get older.
No, I know. That's the question I have. Don't. Because you see, in my consciousness, I believe in internal life, body.
Yeah.
What do you call it? Not really, and you know what I mean. But there's a part of me that is unconscious, that is conditioning from outside.
Yeah.
Okay, when I was young, or I was told this and that. And what I realized, anyways, for myself, is that the part that is unconscious is leading sometimes, and makes my body go older.
Okay.
Okay, so am I right when I say that? I mean, there's a part of me that is conscious about
Right.
Eternal life, and there's a part of me that is not conscious and thinks that I have to get older and thinks that I'm going to die.
Right.
So what do you do about that?
Well, one of my friends asked Babaji what was the secret to healing the death urge and being immortal, and his answer was to outlive it. Well, so there's two things happening. One is your divine self, and the other is your conditioned self.
Yeah.
And so ultimately your divine self has the power to outlive the conditioned self. And the other aspect is we have to keep choosing the quality of our thoughts and the quality of our direction. So the rotation of the Earth around the sun doesn't make you older or younger. It's up to you. And the meaning of the rotation of the Earth around the sun is determined by your arbitrary choice, your arbitrary power of choice. So it is possible to get younger every year as it is possible to get older every year. The meaning is up to you. And when you choose to stay in touch with your divine nature, then the youthing process has a tendency to become automatic. So, to finish the story of rebirthing, in 1981, I totally burned out. And that's the year I discovered fire. And what I learned from the immortal yogis is that earth, air, water, and fire are the physical qualities of spirit. They're the physics of metaphysics. And the mind is just a quality of spirit. And earth, air, water, and fire are the physical qualities. The mind is the supreme quality because it is the director of the power, but the mind is not the source of the power. The power is beyond the mind. And so we have to get our power from moving beyond the mind. And then when we're in that power, we have total choice. And we can choose whatever is happening to the conditioning. So we have to utilize, consciously use our power of the mind and realize that it's not the source of the power. And that the source of the power is actually immortal, right? It's perfect all the time. And always will be and always has been. So we have to keep dipping into that power and keep letting go of our negative conditioning. And we have a tendency automatically to grow out of that negative conditioning. So we just have to keep choosing and letting the mind dissolve into the knowledge of our divine potential. And so I burned out in 1980, I discovered fire. And what I learned from the immortal yogis is that the energy body, the rainbow body, is the secret to their immortality. And to clean the energy body with earth, air, water, and fire, good diet, fasting, exercise, percussion, touch, working with any of the senses, liberates the body from the mind. And bathing twice a day is a routine, which immortal yogis, even if they live in a cave by a river and they bathe twice a day. It's their normal discipline. And they do that not to get rid of the dirt, but to get rid of the negative energy. And so water purification automatically cleans the mind as well as the energy body. And fire is as important as water. I had a woman come to my training center. She had what I call the guru belly phenomena, because we collect emotional energy pollution, and I gave you a handout on that. It's very important. And so I said, what you have to do is spend 2 to 4 hours every day with the fire in order to get rid of your energy body. And you're not going to be an effective participant in the training center unless you do that. So the first day that she spent 4 hours with the fire, she lost 2 inches off of her waistline. So she was highly motivated to continue. And there were 2 other women living at the training center, and they were inspired, and they all started spending 2 to 4 hours with the fire, and they all had to buy new clothes after a couple of weeks. But the original woman that I told to do that lost the discipline and just neglected it. And so this is a problem, because when we do something that works, to the extent that it works, we have an abundance of energy, and then we don't feel the need to do it anymore. So we let it slide until we become miserable. And if we become too miserable, then we don't care. We just collapse and become miserable and die. And so we have to master that cycle of noticing, and with me, I mean, I use a tape measure. I notice that when my waistline gets 2 to 3 inches out of line, I'm miserable. And I become so miserable, I'm motivated to spend time with the fire. So I spend 2 to 4 hours with the fire, I lose 2 inches. And it becomes a cause and effect relationship that is as ordinary as food. I mean, most people, when they're hungry, they eat, right? But when most people are spiritually hungry, they don't eat. And so women have a bigger problem with discipline than men because of menstruation. Menstruation, the blood is the unity of earth, air, water, and fire, and intelligence. And menstruating young women keep the human race alive, but they don't even realize that. I wrote a book called About Your Femininity. And every woman who's read that book said, how can a man, know this about us when I can't learn it from any other woman? And the reason is because I did so much spiritual purification that I became aware of everything that was happening in my wife's body. And I became aware and was processing whenever I was around pregnant women, I was processing the energy of the baby inside the mother. And so I decided to write a little book about it. And so as a result of that, I realized that when women are pregnant, they don't menstruate. So what happens to the energy that they collect in the world? The baby has to deal with it. And so when I realized that, I offered to any pregnant couple full support of food and lodging for a year. They could come for a year when they got pregnant to my center and not have to worry about money. And I encouraged them to do spiritual purification as a full-time job while they were pregnant. And in most cases, they did a perfect underwater birth. And the babies turned out to be geniuses. So
I thought that women had a hard time to have that discipline because we are conditioned to do things for others.
yes, but the reason that you're conditioned is because menstruation is taking care of it. Part of the feminine mystique is to process the energy of other people, and that's what I mean when I say that menstruating young women keep the human race alive. But women are so used to God doing it for them that the idea of discipline just goes out the window. And instead you go into resentment. And the statistics are that single women live longer than married women. Married men live longer than single men. So the whole mystery of death is determined by menstruation. And who understands it? You have to read my little book. It never became a big seller. Women resent learning it from a man. So you guys got to rewrite the book. And market the book. Help me market the idea.
And what happened when a woman doesn't have any more menstruation?
What?
When the woman has no more menstruation, what happened?
They die.
They die, but no.
We know, right? They die. Unless they learn spiritual purification with earth, air, water, and fire voluntarily, they die.
Well, they live longer than 45, 50 years old. And who stop the menstruation on 45, 50?
So then you have to do spiritual purification voluntarily and intentionally. And you have to develop the disciplines that, first of all, clean and balance the energy body, which means getting rid of all this junk that you've accumulated. Secondly, you have to do enough spiritual purification to stay ahead of the pollution process of participating in your everyday life. And then thirdly, you have to continue a maintenance program that enables you to win the spiritual purification game. So
Because they don't die right away. They just get sick and sicker and sicker and sicker, and
They died at 60, but they are putting in the earth at 80.
yeah, they start dying with sickness, but they don't die.
well, changing your thoughts can heal any disease known to man.
Yeah.
Water purification can heal any disease known to man. Fire purification can heal any disease known to man. Breathing can heal any disease known to man. Improving your diet or fasting can heal any disease known to man. Other talented healers can heal any disease known to men. So those are our resources.
What's the best way to connect with the earth element? Is it camping or sleeping on the ground? Something like that?
To connect with?
Earth.
Well, it starts with what you eat every day. And developing an exercise system. And so my favorite exercise system, which I used for decades, was to walk around the block once a day. And that sustained me. Now I need to do a little more elaborate exercise system. So I'm doing the 5 Tibetan rites, and I have certain routines that I like to do every day in order to move the pain. And so pain is a motivator. And so when we have pain, then we have to find out how to get rid of the pain. And sometimes it can get a little complicated. Takes meditation and solitude. If you spend enough time in solitude, you get control of yourself.
Massage works also. For earth, massage.
Massage. Yeah, massage is fantastic. If you give yourself enough pleasure, you'll forgive everything. Okay, any more questions? We finished?
I have one question about tub and how do you get the ear hole rid of water once you get out of the tub?
Doing what with the ears?
Well, when you soak in the tub, the ears are in the water. Because the only part that's out is the nose and mouth. But the ear lobes, the ear channel, the ear hole gets wet. How do you dry it out?
Oh,
Q-tip.
No, you don't.
But no.
well, I mean, I use a towel, but I don't know that it's a problem.
Well, my ears are getting irritated from soaking in the water twice a day. I can't clear the water out sufficiently. So
Well, do you use Q-tips?
no, I don't. I don't want to use Q-tips because I was told by the doctors that they would take too much of the wax out of the ear, and then the tympan would be harmed.
Well, then I would recommend that you only use Q-tips once a day. And the other time you can
Live with the wet ear all day?
let nature take care of itself. What?
Live with the ears wet all day?
Oh, well, they won't stay wet all day. They'll dry themselves.
Okay.
But you should use Q-tips once a day to experience the benefit of that.
You use ear plugs No. Never-
Well, earwax kind of takes care of itself too.
Plugs, do you put something in the ear before you go into the tub?
Well, that's another possibility. You can experiment with all of those solutions.
I did already, and they don't work, none of them. None of them work. I still have a problem with the ear. It's preventing me from taking pleasure from the back.
I think they all will work.
Ah, thank you.
And you'll develop a balance.
Thank you.